Making your own pillowcase is such a fun, quick, simple thing to make. And if you're new to sewing, this is a great project to start with. I'm Jan Howell and welcome back to my channel. I'm so excited to show you how to make these pillowcases. I'm going to show you 4 easy methods. They take about 15 minutes to make and only 1 yard of fabric. I'm going to show you how you can make them using a regular sewing machine, how to make them using a serger, how to sew a French seam, and I'm going to show you how to add a contrasting cuff and trim using the burrito method that I think you're really going to like. They make such fun gifts and they really are enjoyable to make. So get out your sewing machine and let's get started. Let's go over the items and things that you'll need. In the description below, I have a link that you can download and print this pillowcase cutting out guide. Now it's going to give you measurements for a standard, a queen, and a king size pillowcase, for the regular pillowcase and the contrasting cuff. You'll need the fabric that you're going to make your pillowcase with. A standard pillowcase takes 1 yard of fabric. You can use flannel or quilter's cotton. And if you want to add a contrasting cuff, like this particular pillowcase, isn't this cute? You'll need a strip of fabric, and if you want to add a little trim, you'll need a little piece of fabric for that. I'll go over the measurements in just a bit. You'll need a pair of fabric scissors. I love using a rotary cutter and mat and ruler. This makes square projects and projects like this so much easier to cut out, but you still can use scissors if you don't have a rotary cutter. You'll need some pins or fabric clips, and you'll also need a seam gauge or a measuring tape. You'll need a sewing machine, and if you want to use your serger, I'll show you how to do that. You'll need an iron and ironing board. You'll want to put a universal needle in your machine, 80 or 90 in size. And if you want to add a cute tag or label to the seam of your pillowcase, I'll show you how to do that and have those handy. I do have a tutorial showing you how to make these DIY fabric labels. That's really quite easy. The link will be in the description below. The first method and style of pillowcase, I'm going to use the regular sewing machine, and I'll show you how to use the serger. So let's talk fabric for just a second. When you buy fabric on the bolt from the fabric store, it will come with a selvaged edge, and this is what it looks like, and this is the cut edge. Most woven fabrics, flannel pieces, and quilter's cotton come about 44 to 45 inches wide. To save time and to make it really easy, we'll cut it first to that 44, just the width of your fabric, and then we'll cut off an inch from each edge, just to cut off that selvage edge and get it the width that we need. For a king size pillowcase, I'm going to cut it 42 inches long. This king size pillowcase does take more than a yard. This piece of fabric, the edges have already been squared off because I've used it for other projects, but when you get it from the fabric store, they don't always cut it straight. So you'll want to make sure that you first straighten off the edges and make sure that it's lying flat. And I'm going to do that by lining up the selvaged edges and making sure that they're not all ski-wampus and it's laying flat and not crooked. You'll be able to tell. And then you'll line up your selvaged edges with the line on your cutting mat. So you can see how on the other side it's not quite. So I'm going to take a little bit off that end to give me that straight edge. And I'm going to flip it this way and measure my 42 inches. Be sure to save your scraps. Fold that in half. So my folded edges are lined up. So we want this folded piece from fold to selvaged edge to measure 21 inches. And see, that piece that we're taking off is like 3/4 of an inch. It's not even a full inch. Not all fabrics are going to be the same in width from the bolt. Pretty close, but not always. So it's better just to measure that 21 inches doubled. And when you're making blankets or pillowcases or something and you cut off the selvage edge, sometimes it's really easy to get the selvage edge mixed up with the cut edge, and you don't want to mix that up because you'll have an odd size pillowcase. Put a safety pin in that edge just to help me remember if I get distracted or something and come back to the project, you will know which is the salvaged edge because it will make a difference. So that's just a little tip that might save you some grief later down the road. Take one of the cut edges, place it right side facing down, and fold up the edge a 1/2 inch and press all the way across. So a really cool tip is to either make your own or buy these pressing seam templates. This is cut to a 1/2 inch and you can just slide it underneath there, fold up the fabric till it comes to the edge and press. Now I'm going to fold it up 4 inches and press. Unfold that 4-inch fold, bring the right sides together. I'm going to leave that 1/2 inch fold still folded, line up my edges, pin that in place. Now that we know which edge is that selvage edge, we're going to remove that pin. Line up your bottom edges and the side seams. Pin it in a few places. Then all you're going to do is take it to the sewing machine using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Start here and sew all the way down to that corner and down the bottom edge and back stitch here. I have set my sewing machine to a regular stitch. Use a 1/2 inch seam allowance, starting at that 1/2 inch fold. Back stitch, of course, at the beginning and the end of your seams. Now here's a little trick and tip for especially when you're sewing long pieces of fabric with a particular seam allowance is to, you can see the 1/2 inch seam allowance mark right there, but when you're using a long piece of fabric, this really helps to keep it in alignment and helps keep it straight. So I'm going to find that 1/2 inch seam allowance mark on my machine and just using a piece of, you can use masking tape, this is painter's tape, I'm going to align that with that 1/2 inch mark. Make sure that these folded edges are lined up before you start. When you get to the corner, leave your needle down, lift up your presser foot, pivot it, and continue to sew along the bottom, back stitching at the end. Now you'll want to finish off the seams so that they don't fray. So there's several different ways that you can finish off your seams, and I have another tutorial showing you different ways to get the overlock stitch just on your sewing machine, but I'm not going to go into detail right now. I'm just going to sew a simple zigzag stitch all the way down right along on the inside of that cut edge. I'm going to change my stitch to a zigzag stitch, the setting to 4 wide and 3 in length. And that is what it looks like. If you are using your serger, use a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And if you're not sure where that is, because there really isn't a guide plate, take your seam gauge and just to know which of these lines are a 1/2 inch. So I'm going to measure from that left edge of the stitch, that left needle, and that would be that first line there. Make sure you're not sewing over needles because that will ruin your knife. I've done it before. And when you get to the end, so you don't have these big wonky tails, just sew to the end, take your hand wheel and turn it so the needle goes up and down once, lift up your presser foot, pull it back and pivot it, and then just slide your fabric underneath there again, butt it up to the needles, line up your cutting point, put your presser foot back down and continue to sew. Now this is the form of like back stitching, so making sure that this stitch isn't going to come undone. Instead of just leaving a big tail, stitch off the fold one stitch, turn your hand wheel towards you, lift up your presser foot, pivot it over and flip it over. Just take it right back in front of the needle, put the presser foot back down and start sewing. And then I'm going to just sew off like that, and you can cut your thread. Now that's not going to come undone. You don't have these wonky tails, and that's how you do it with the serger. We've already pre-pressed this 1/2 inch fold. Now just fold it the 4 inches, and we've already pre-pressed that, so it should be pretty easy to find that fold. And then you'll want to pin it in place. And then we'll take it to the sewing machine and just top stitch. Of course, putting it with this side facing up so that you can see the edge, and we'll be sewing just like right inside the folded edge right there. Top stitching all the way around. So you can either remove the arm and slip your pillowcase like this in your machine, or you can turn it inside out. Let me just show you how that would look. So you can sew it like this. Does that make sense? So if you don't have that option, just flip it inside out. Either way works fine. Put your sewing machine back on a straight stitch if you had that zigzag stitch set up. I'm top stitching just barely inside that line. You can adjust your needle over to the right if your sewing machine does that. Then I can use that darker indicator line to help me keep this straight. So I like doing that. Starting at that side seam, I'm gonna put my presser foot down so the edge of my fabric is on that big line or that darker line, or just sew along the edge. Is not real critical here. And again, back stitch. And another tip, I like having a pin cushion by my sewing machine and on my cutting table. I just keep one in both places so that when I remove pins, I can put them here, and then when I need pins, I can use my other pin cushion, so I'm not having to keep going back and finding my pin cushion. Clip your threads, turn it right side facing out. Use your turning stick to poke the corners out. There you have that first simple method, either with a serger or your sewing machine. Look at that nice finish, nice hem. Make up another one for a set of pillowcases. What a fun gift. Now let's go over how to make that pillowcase with a contrasting cuff and with that little piece of trim. I'm using this cute dog print for the biggest part of the pillowcase, this for the cuff and this for the trim. You want to make sure that your ends are straight again. I'm going to make this a standard size pillowcase. I'll cut this main piece of fabric 28 inches long. We're not going to worry about cutting off edges right now. We'll do that after we put everything together. I'll show you what that will look like. So I have my main piece. The cuff piece I'm going to cut in length 9 inches. So again, we'll want to square off that edge. If you want to add a little narrow trim like I have with this polka dot piece, this will be cut at 2 inches in the same width. So as you can see, the pillowcase will look like this. The characters on the pillowcase are facing sideways. Now, it's just your preference. Some people like to have the print facing this way, but that means if you turn the pillowcase over, they're going to be upside down. So it just depends on the look you want. I'm going to, for this pillowcase, turn them this way so that the bottom cuff will be right here and the trim this way. So I hope that makes sense. I will show you how to cut it out if you want to cut it out with the print facing this way on the next pillowcase method. Let's put this all together. Take your cuff piece, place the right side facing up, take the main piece of fabric, make sure you have the end that you want next to the cuff, place that on top. And don't worry if one is wider than the other. We're going to be trimming off the selvage edges in just a second here. And I'll line up those edges. If you're adding the narrow trim, place that on top. This is the cut edges in line with the cut edges of the main piece. So clip that in place in a few places, and then we'll put more pins in or clips in just a second. This is why they call it the burrito method. I'm going to take this in and make a little roll, like a jelly roll. I'm just going to roll it towards the cuff until I see my cuff piece. Then you can take your cuff piece, fold it over the top, and line up the edges. And we're going to pin it in place all along this edge. Make sure that the cuff ends are lined up. We're going to take it to the sewing machine and sew a 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way down the bottom edge. So this is where the magic happens. You're going to pull out that jelly roll from the tube that you just created. Unroll the main fabric, give it a shake, and voila. Doesn't that trim look nice? So you have that trim, and note the seam is hidden inside. Isn't that the coolest thing? So we want to give it a good pressing, both from the front and the back, so that you're pulling out that fabric so it's completely open and flat. Bring the right sides together, and it's really important that we line up these edges of the cuff and the trim, and this is where we'll cut off those selvaged edges. So most of your rulers are not going to be long enough for that cut, so I'm going to just line up those folded edges on the left here, smooth it out, and we'll cut the folded pillowcase to 21 inches. For this pillowcase, I'm just going to use the serger to finish this off, and then in the next version, I'm going to show you how to finish it with a French seam. So the right sides are together. I'm lining, making sure those edges of the trim and the cuff are lined up. Clip it in place and just sew it down and along the bottom with your serger. Or you can use, of course, your single needle machine and finish off the edges with a zigzag stitch. If you've been following me very long, you know that I like to add tags to my projects. This is a tag that I made, and they are really cute on the pillowcases. So how to apply that, if you're interested, is if I'm just using a regular straight stitch or the serger stitch, I'm going to center it on the cuff there. Find the halfway where the seam is going to go. And I like to have a little bit of a white trim around it. I'm going to clip that in place and then go to the sewing machine and just baste it before I do my seam. That way it's not shifting and it's not going anywhere or won't be crooked when I sew my seam. Now a tip for when you're using a serger and you don't want this tail, the thread tails, to be hanging off the edge here. You want a nice clean finish and not be able to see the serger threads. Make sure the ends are lined up. I'm going to start sewing about maybe 2 inches away from the end. Now again, I'm using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. I'm going to stitch right up to the end of the fold of the pillowcase. Make sure the needles are up, lift up my presser foot. I'm going to pull it back just a little bit, flip it over, lift up my presser foot so that I can slide the fabric up so it bumps up against to where, let's bring my needle down just a little bit. So it bumps up just onto the needles there. Flip your fabric over, bring your presser foot down, and start sewing. I'm going to check to make sure my things are lined up, and they're a little bit off, so I'm going to lift up my presser foot, pull that so they're lining up. Now, the trick for sewing over these big bulky seams, I've shown you in some other videos, but I'll show you here again. You can use your hump jumper, or I've made one just out of folded cereal box, so that's about that thick. I'm going to place it underneath the back of my presser foot. Slide it back there so the back of my presser foot is resting on that, and bring your presser foot back down, and that will help go over that big bulky area. So I'm going to do that little flip thing again. Give it a final pressing. Wow, that turned out so cute, didn't it? Okay, we have one more method to go over. I'm going to make another contrasting cuff pillowcase using a French seam. In the previous pillowcase that we made, the print was facing sideways and the long edge of the pillowcase was cut along the selvage edge. But if you wanted to flip the print and have the cats facing upright, you'll need to cut it out just a little bit differently, and it does take a little bit more fabric, but I'm going to show you how to do that. So I'm going to square off my ends as I usually would, because this has not been, look how crooked that is and how jaggedy that is. I'm going to open this up and fold it in half. I'm going to trim off the selvaged edge, and we'll measure from there. You just don't want this writing edge to show up in your pillowcase. So that's where I'll measure from this edge down, and this needs to be cut to 28 inches. I'm going to place the cuff piece down, right side facing up, line that up. And remember, we'll cut these off later. Remember, the seam allowance is a 1/2 inch. On this machine, it's really hard to see that 1/2 inch mark. So I'm going to use this little device, or of course, I could use my tape, but I'm going to put this magnet seam gauge guide down at the 1/2 inch. Turn your burrito roll right side facing out and press. Now I'm going to show you how to sew French seams on this pillowcase. But first we need to cut off that excess on the cuff. So I'll just line those up. We're placing wrong sides together, and I know this seems counterintuitive and not right, but we're going to start with the right side facing out, lining up those points. Now if you want to add a tag to a pillowcase that you're using a French seam in, you need to apply it a little differently. So usually I would flip that over and just encase that in my seam on the wrong side, but now we're going to just base that in place and have it stick out to the right. Take in mind that that's going to be folded over like this, and then hopefully we'll get that seam allowance right there, so it will be that white border. Different application, put it over to the right, barely in, and then baste it in place, and then go ahead and sew your first pass with the 1/4 inch seam allowance. So this first pass is your 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'm going to move my needle over to the right to get that 1/4 inch seam allowance. If your sewing machine has that ability, it's really nice. If you don't, you can just follow the guide there on your foot, or of course put your tape down for your guide. I'm going to move my needle over to the right to the 2.5 position and start sewing. Another tip is to keep the top thread from bunching up and kind of giving a little nest at the start of your seam is to hold that thread for the first couple stitches, and then it won't bunch up like that. Make sure the cuff edges are lined up. When I get to the end on this fold, I'm going to backstitch. I'm going to clip the corners. And if there are any stray threads, which I don't have this time with this fabric, you'll want to cut those off and turn it wrong side facing out. You'll want to get some kind of turning stick to poke the corners out. Start with this edge, and you want to make sure that the fabric's all the way pushed out so you don't catch that seam allowance inside when we sew our 3/8 inch seam allowance. I found a trick to help with the finger so you don't have to lick your fingers or so the edges are out all the way, is to give that edge a shot of steam. Then it's more grippy with your fingers. Alright, so now the next seam allowance is going to be a little bit bigger, so it'll encase this seam allowance inside and you won't even see it. I'm going to change my needle position back to the center, and that will give me my 3/8 inch seam allowance along the edge of my presser foot. Let me show you what that looks like when you turn it right side facing out. So you have that seam allowance all enclosed, finished, not going to fray. And turn that right side facing out, poke out the corners, give it a good pressing. There you have it. 4 different ways to make a pillowcase using a serger, a regular sewing machine, or a French seam. Plain finish, or adding a contrasting cuff. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed that. Go grab a yard of fabric and make pillowcases. These make really fun gifts, and it's a good time of the year to do that, and they really are quite easy to make, as you can see. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, make sure you do that. Stay tuned for some more upcoming tutorials, crafting, sewing, and do-it-yourself around the house tutorials. If you're interested in upcoming tutorials, make sure you're clicking on the bell and turning on your notifications, so when I put something new up, you won't miss out. If you want to check out my pattern selections, get on my website, youmakeitsimple.com, and make sure you download your free PDF pillowcase guide with all the sizes and cutting measurements. Have a wonderful day, have fun sewing, and we'll see you next time.